Namaskar and welcome to this exciting episode of Sattology, debunking mythology. Sattology means science of truth, or study of truth. Opposite of that is mythology, which means science or study of fake, lie, or imagination. You all know that Sattology is the word we should use for credible, archaeologically proved history of the world. Sometimes archaeological proofs are not enough because there are a lot of traditions also function. There are multiple factors which build up a history of the place, and archaeological proofs can only go to certain extent. So local folklores and local traditions, and also the cultural aspect, the food eating habits, the language, and also the method of worship also plays a very important role in understanding the historicity of any particular place. Today, a very, very special guest. He's a French journalist living in India, and also he's director of India Foundation. And he contributes a lot to the Indian history and civilization living in India. So let us welcome Mr. Kome Carpentier.
Welcome and namaskar.
I did not destroy your name this time, right?
Well, you said Kome. In fact, it's Kome, but in India, many people call me Kome because there is an E at the end, not a B, like some people think.
Kome Carpentier. Yes. So, looking at the Ukraine-Russian conflict, so who is actually paying for the war? This is one common question comes in, like who is paying for this? Zelensky has no money. He has just asked for, almost collected $56 billion and asked for more 100 also. So, but who is paying for it?
Before I answer, I would like to introduce a very small correction. I'm not director of India Foundation, but distinguished fellow. I don't want to tread on anybody's toes. Back to Ukraine. Obviously, this is a question on which there are very few experts. Lots of people talk about it and think they are experts, but very few people know the facts. And I do not see myself as one of those who knows all the facts. In fact, clearly, I do not. But you gather here and there from a number of sources some understanding about what may be going on. Clearly, Ukraine has become a magnet for a lot of people, honest or not, who, in the guise of donating, expect to make money because there is a very lucrative weapons business going on with several countries. And one doesn't always know where these weapons are going, who is using them. Apparently, many are being resold on the black market. Some will end up in other troubled areas like the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond. And others even apparently end up in the Russian military forces, whether they have been sold by unscrupulous Ukrainians or whether the Russians somehow got hold of them. So this whole thing is obviously far from clear. And it is true that there is, I would say by and large, there is a pattern which repeats what happened during World War II, when the US started with Britain a Lend-Lease operation. Essentially Lend-Lease was not a gift, it was a loan which had to be repaid. And as many people know, the end of this repayment only happened about 6-7 years ago, or maybe a little more. I'm not quite sure about that, but it took a very long time for Britain to repay its debt. So I think that's also what's happening with Ukraine, because clearly they will have to repay all this. And even though everybody in the European Union is discussing whether more money is needed, and the presidency of the EU said that there would be several billion provided over the next few years, but then several European countries do not agree. They feel that it's costing them too much, and they have already sacrificed too much for Ukraine. And one of the stalwart opponents of this EU initiative is the Prime Minister of Hungary, Mr. Orban. So as you can tell, there is no unity. And I don't know how things will go. I mean, clearly, if the fight keeps going on, a lot of people will get war fatigue in the West and will look for a way out. Obviously, the farther you are from the conflict, the less you have to lose, and the more likely you are to keep feeding the conflict. But for example, I saw no later than no earlier than yesterday, or there was a report that President Zelensky had signed a comprehensive agreement with BlackRock. And BlackRock is supposed to provide a platform, that is the language used, for attracting investments from all over the world to finance Ukraine. Now, considering BlackRock runs several $1 trillion, if I remember right, in investments, and therefore has huge capabilities, at least as a funnel for investments, you would expect that this would become a major business operation, because obviously BlackRock is not into charity. BlackRock is not into charity. So there will be a return over many years for the BlackRock investors. Of course, Russian press has immediately come out with the reports that essentially Zelensky had sold Ukraine to BlackRock. That may be an exaggeration, but there is no question that Ukraine is getting deeply in debt, we might say in hoc, to major financial institutions, particularly in the West.
Are you
there?
Yes. You covered FTX. FTX you have not touched upon, because FTX is one major controversy in the US right now going on. And also if you look at the BRICS, now increasingly it is getting featured in the American analysis as well. That is one of the growing groups where all the enemies of USA are involved, except probably India and South Africa. And but most of the enemies are getting involved. So do you think that's a right perspective from the Americans to look at the BRICS as an enemy of USA?
If you remember, BRICS was coined as a concept, as BRIC, not BRICS yet, by somebody from Goldman Sachs, Mr. John O'Neill. So it didn't look like an enemy or an inimical creation. It was essentially an assessment by some major financial institutions, primarily on Wall Street, that these countries were potentially the new economic superpowers. And at that time, we were talking of 4 countries. They were talking of 4 countries. This was probably 12, 13 years ago. China, India, Russia, and Brazil. Afterwards, South Africa was added primarily because China wanted to include the most dynamic and economically advanced part of Africa. But there is no question that BRICS poses a challenge to the West, to the so-called Western liberal bloc, insofar as the Western liberal bloc is failing and is getting into deeper and deeper financial and economic trouble. Otherwise, BRICS by itself is still relatively far away from taking over worldwide. And if you look at BRICS from the standpoint of its members, you see that they are not necessarily on the same page. I mean, China and India have a number of problems, bilateral problems, misgivings, and sometimes break into open conflict. Obviously, Brazil is very far away and has its own set of priorities. And we know now that Brazil is in deep trouble because the elections have been somewhat indecisive, and there is a great deal of protest from the losing side. And the winning side, which appears to be Mr. Lula da Silva's coalition, will have great trouble setting up a stable government. So Brazil is into one of its usual periods of political and economic crisis. As far as South Africa is concerned, it is, we know, a very troubled country, which still has a semi-colonial economy. And China itself, which is a superpower in the group, has an increasing amount of unrest to deal with because the growth has pretty much stopped. Therefore, there is no longer an economic miracle at play. And furthermore, I think the increasing power of Mr. Xi Jinping has alienated a lot of people, even among his allies in the ruling party, in the Politburo. And you will see a large number of street protests generated by the rather, I would say, extreme, if not worse, policy that the Chinese government has adopted supposedly to contain COVID or eradicate COVID, which is a an impossible task. I mean, it's really a fool's errand. Whatever that is, the fact is that none of the BRICS countries is in optimum shape. India is probably now the most stable and the fastest growing country, with a strong and stable government and a relatively peaceful internal situation. So in that sense, you could say that India has been a great beneficiary of BRICS because by participating in the international financial institutions that BRICS has set up, it has been able to increase its financial leverage and to develop alternative means of financing to the World Bank and IMF, which means that it has become very independent from the West-controlled financial institutions. And likewise, in terms of political emergence, India has benefited on the international stage because apart from being a member of BRICS, it is also, as we know now, the chairman of the G20 group of countries, and it is also going to be the chair of the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization group of countries. So India is definitely a sort of a prima donna, if you want to call it that way, or at least a sort of main character on the world stage right now.
And you forgot to mention the UNSC presidency also, India's case.
Right. That goes along with it. But of course, UNSC presidency does not always mean much. But anyway, it's there as an honorary, an additional feather in India's cap.
Yeah. So I think that's a big coincidence. But the thing is, which I see in the American media now, gradually, Colonel McGregor and Jeffrey Sachs have been very vocal about the American non-participation or withdrawal from Ukraine and honoring the Minsk agreement. But we see the uniparty. Now we call both Democrats and Republicans uniparty because both were found equally involved in the FTX scandal. So the unitary party, which is both sides of the aisle in US Congress and Senate, now they increasingly favor the war or taking the confrontation to the next level. Do you think the world will allow that? Because I feel very confused about this, because when we talk about peace, then US talks about peace on their terms. Rules-based order is a rules-based order on the Western terms. So will the world today accept it? Because Russia has clearly broken the military myth, actually.
The US is very divided about Ukraine, like most countries are. For most Americans, Ukraine means very little. Once I joked that for many people, Ukraine would probably be considered like a variant of U-Haul, a company to move cranes on one zone. So there hardly anybody knew about it until a couple of years ago. And so on the political side, there is obviously hay to be made by the sunshine, in the sense that the Democrats have struck this very resolute position under the leadership of Biden by saying that we have to essentially make up for our loss in Afghanistan and our rather chaotic retreat there by showing that we can stand in Ukraine, even if we are leading from behind, which was President Obama's advice to the US. Don't lead from the front anymore because you may not have the power to do it or the resources, but lead from behind, which is what the US has been trying to do. And if you see now a lot of documents which have been hacked from the Ukraine general staff, probably by Russian hackers, we don't know, you see the kind of micromanagement of the war that the US military advisors have been providing to Ukrainian military leadership day by day, which means the US is very deeply involved without taking official responsibility. It is absolutely trying to coordinate the Ukrainian campaign against Russia, because obviously there is a sense in Washington that if the US could guide Ukraine into reconquering the lost territories in the East, it would be not only a victory for Ukraine as a US ally and a prospective NATO member. In fact, it's already a NATO member for all practical purposes, but it would also give enormous credibility to the Biden administration for standing by its protege and delivering a victory on the Russians. On the other hand, you have cited Colonel McGregor. There are quite a few other military experts, generally on the Republican conservative side, who have been quite critical of the US involvement in Ukraine. They go back to President George Washington's advice, which was to avoid entanglement with European powers and European wars. But of course, America has largely forgotten this since more than a century, and they are just jumping with both feet in any conflict that originates in Europe. So this is happening again. And I don't know who will prevail, because the Trumpist side of the Republican Party would probably like to take its distance, as we have seen recently in Congress, when Congresswoman Taylor and others have made some very vibrant speeches against Biden's involvement, I mean, the Biden administration's involvement in Ukraine. And of course, they were promptly accused by the rhinos, including Mrs. The daughter of the former vice president, Cheney. Liz Cheney has accused them of being pro-Putin and pro-Nazi, which is paradoxical because we all know that many Ukrainians make no bones about being successors of their own Nazi leaders in the 1940s. So there is a clear question as to who is a Nazi, and maybe nobody is really a Nazi, although some people claim to be. But the fact is that there is no point throwing accusations on both sides that you are a Nazi and you are a worse Nazi than I am. Anyway, this is the confusion that prevails nowadays. And I don't know where that is going. Clearly, the Russians are waiting out the Europeans because the Europeans are getting exhausted economically and even in physical terms because of the increasing problems with the cost of living, the scarcity of energy, and the collapse of the industrial sector. So they hope that the Europeans will finally come to the table and negotiate, provided the Americans let them do it, and the Americans also agree to a settlement, which will be some sort of a compromise. Clearly, the Russians want to see the river Dnieper as a border between what they regard as Russia, Novorossiya, since the 18th century it was theirs, and the west of Ukraine, which will remain a Carpathian Middle European country. So that would be probably the most reasonable solution, unless the Ukrainians dig in their heels and claim that they still want everything back, including Crimea, even though they frankly have no historical claims to that region. But be that as it may, since they got that border designed by the Soviet Union, they claim that this border should remain permanent. So I don't know how far the US will go. Nowadays, the Biden administration is going to be involved in so many legal proceedings from the Republicans who are going to go after the Biden's father, son, and brother. So I don't know if the administration will have a lot of time and energy to spend on Ukraine, but then time will tell.
The world is actually now witnessing that even the Americans are thinking that they are in the wrong place because the majority of the Americans' priority is different, reducing inflation and reducing cost of life and gas prices, which is still high now. But all these extra factors, which are retained by the media, not by the Americans. Mostly the media is talking all these things. Americans are not even concerned. I hardly know if any American I meet personally that they really watch these media reports anyway. So what do you think the world, because the world sees what the American media produces. World doesn't see what the American people talk, just like Americans don't see what the people talk in other countries. Mostly see what the media is talking about. Do you think that the media is actually creating these kind of wars and unnecessary situations, or they are controlled by some people who are actually creating it?
I think the answer has been given long ago by people who are in very prominent positions, like Robert Kennedy Jr. He has pointed out, and I think Elon Musk has agreed with him on this, that the media are owned by 5 major corporate groups, which are closely tied to political and financial interests. And these 5 groups make sure that all media all over the US repeat the same thing at the same time every day. And it's very clear if you hear the news broadcast on radio and television, except for some independent small media, you will find that they give you exactly the same lines and they come to the same conclusions with touching unanimity. So all that is, of course, the sort of corporate party line that, you know, this is to happen because this is the way it should be. And Europe is pretty much the same. I mean, you also have these major government tied television networks, the BBC, and you name them, all of, you know, plus major newspapers, plus the major websites, which will give you the same thing and will try to qualify any dissenting opinion as either fake news or Russian propaganda or just some very perverse and wicked perversion of facts. But if you look at independent reporters and people who really have been on the ground in Ukraine and in Russia, you get, of course, a very different picture from what the Western major media are giving you, which is that Russia is about to collapse, Putin is an isolated dictator locked into the Kremlin, and a lot of generals and other members of the Russian power structure want to get rid of him. Now, that's not happening. There are, of course, disagreements within the Russian leadership, and that's always the case in wars. But by and large, it has been depressingly clear to the Western media that a large proportion, maybe 60, 70% of the Russian public feels that this war is a very sad thing, but it was almost inevitable because of the situation which had been created by American interventions in Eastern Europe and the insistence of NATO to build up a new Iron Curtain on the border of Russia with a very powerful military system, which could technically or potentially attack the Russian mainland. Now, you might say that the Russians are wrong and this never would have happened, but in a war, you have to take into account the opinions of both sides. And the Russians are not just making things up. If you look at the preparations made by NATO in the last few years, you realize that there was a clear intent to essentially corral Russia. You know, from the east, from the south, from the west, there was that attempt to build up this kind of fence around Russia, even in the Arctic Ocean, you know, where you have now this ganging up of the Arctic Western powers in which the US has taken the lead, even though the US has not signed the Arctic Treaty. But now the US is saying, no, we have to be there, and Russia cannot be allowed to have a sort of unchallenged access to that overall region. So obviously the Russians have reacted as they tended to in the past. They have reacted to what they perceive to be an encirclement. And they have wanted to break that encirclement by forcing Ukraine to be neutral, which was a requirement in the first place, which was agreed upon at the time of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. It was agreed between Mr. Gorbachev and Western leaders. But then, of course, this was promptly forgotten. And the Americans said, no, every inch of land outside of Russia should be part of NATO. And they wanted to get in to Belarus. And obviously, Ukraine was the prize. You know, Ukraine was really the jewel in the crown, because Ukraine is the country which can block Russian access to the Black Sea. And it is one of the richest parts of Eastern Europe and of the former Soviet Union.
So we also see Turkey bombing Kurds indiscriminately, and within Syria and within Iraq, Kurds, they're bombing consistently, and the world is very silent. It's a NATO member, and so do you think that NATO itself has become a military bully? And because if Turkey is attacked, then the NATOs have to respond. All NATO countries have to respond.
You see, NATO was formed to prevent wars, but also to fight wars. This is the case for all military alliances. A military alliance which is not ready to fight a war is not a military alliance. Therefore, NATO has only changed insofar as the Warsaw Pact no longer exists, which means NATO was able to extend its way to the borders of Russia. And Turkey plays its own game. Turkey plays on both sides. And Turkey has a primary interest, which is to expand its influence in its region and to prevent any separatism, particularly Kurdish separatism. Now, it's well known that the Americans have supported some factions among the the Kurdish separatists, and Turkey has made that its discontent many times very clear. It has accused Western countries like Sweden and Finland of harboring Kurdish refugees and immigrants, which Turkey considers to be promoters of terrorism. And as you probably heard, when the last terrorist attack took place in Istanbul, the Istiklal Street, Turkey refused to accept the expressions of sympathy and condolences from the US and said, we do not accept it because you know what your role is. In other words, Turkey claimed that the US is behind Kurdish terrorists, which it protects for its own reasons. And so you see that Turkey is not really an unconditional ally of the West, and Turkey has forged now strong economic and even strategic relations with Russia. So NATO cannot count on Turkey, but then one also wonders on which country NATO can count, because at this point, NATO is like the foreign legion of the United States, but then the other countries which are supposed to obey orders from across the Atlantic are not necessarily very happy with it. So the only one that might be almost unconditional in its support would be Britain. But every other country either doesn't have an army in Europe or is really very reluctant to get involved. So what is the value of NATO now? Well, it's mostly the military American power, which is huge. And of course, British power is not insignificant by any means either. But other than that, I think NATO is, dead man walking. I mean, this is what President Macron said last year about NATO, that it was brain dead. Obviously, it still has muscle and sinews, but brain-wise, there isn't much left.
We coming back to the main topic we were discussing, the funding, and who is funding the Ukrainian war again. Now, with all these things happening, it's very clear that the Zelensky was investing in FTX, and increasingly the mainstream media channels like Tucker Carlson show and other people, they are blaming Zelensky for human rights abuses in Ukraine. Now, this is coming up, but the leftist Uniparty, the leftist wing of the Uniparty, is talking about the American, America is back. The first mantra of Biden administration, America is back. So now we see that when America came back, there are wars all over the world. I mean, so is the world is thinking is there a viewpoint that people need America anywhere intervening at all in future?
That's very doubtful. I suppose there must be countries like South Korea. We recently had a visiting delegation from South Korea here. They feel they are bound to follow the American leadership because of their own strategic situation, which is quite precarious between Japan, North Korea, and China, none of which are necessarily very friendly to them. But other than that, there is a great deal of skepticism and even rejection of American military intervention. As you know, now in Germany, there are protests against American forces on German soil. And these protests are generally held in front of US embassies and consulates. I don't know how far that will go, but if you look at the recent visit by Chancellor Scholz to China, you realize that Germany is trying to take a different route. And there is even a sort of a wild rumor that Germany would have contemplated and might still be contemplating joining BRICS. We're back to BRICS here, because they feel that their economy depends upon strong relations with China and Russia, Russia for energy and raw materials, and China for exports. So given this, of course, the Americans have read the Riot Act to Germany and said, you are not going to get gas from Russia. and you have to stand with us because, after all, we are still occupying you, and you are a defeated country, and you should simply follow our instructions. But obviously, that's not the message that Germans are very happy to receive 75 years after World War II. And so, the status quo is very fragile. There is a great deal of friction now between European countries, between France and Germany in particular, but also between Germany and East European nations. So where is that going? I really don't know. As far as Ukraine, love fest and all that funding thrown away into Ukraine's military efforts, as you said, there are lots of very fishy things. Ukraine tried several schemes, including the GoFundMe, in order to buy weapons. Then FTX got involved because FTX was a sort of a money recycling operation, which was obviously very closely connected to some Democrat oligarchs, even though the Republicans also got some benefits out of it. But very clearly, all that money was obviously pilfered because it went into these completely fictitious FT coins, which had no validity whatsoever. And yet some of the most conservative financial institutions in America and in the world put hundreds of millions into this operation, which was very clearly a fly-by-night operation run by a few degenerate kids out of the Bahamas. That's what it was. And so that shows you the enormous corruption and also the enormous weakness in the Western and particularly the US financial system, because essentially it has become a happy hunting ground for con men of all kinds.
See, there is the last question on this series. It has come from the audience. Now, US is on the side of Japan. It's a Japanese ally. US is on the side of South Korea. US is on the side of Pakistan. US is on the side of like all the conflict zones. One party is always the US. So so it's like the question is that, is US a messenger of peace or a messenger of wars? It's a student question.
When you have such a huge military industrial complex, which in real terms is now absorbing over $2.5 trillion every year from the US economy, you can imagine that there are many vested interests in promoting wars. If not wars in which US soldiers are directly involved, but at least wars in which US technology and US weapons sales are at stake. And that is inevitable. When you are so involved in the military industrial manufacturing, you are going to have you will have a need for markets. And if you look at the kind of gigantic purchases that Saudi Arabia and other oil-producing countries have made to the US over the last several years, you see how much the US depended on these countries to keep buying gigantic amounts of weaponry. And they certainly want more countries to join in that race to arm, because that keeps the US arms manufacturing giants running. And clearly they finance political parties, and they have a symbiotic and parasitic relationship with the political establishment. So you cannot say that the US is a messenger of peace, even though they claim to want peace, but then everybody wants peace, provided they get what they want, peace on their terms. Everyone wants that, including the Russians. But in the case of the US, they don't feel they need to compromise so far, because they feel they have enough military clout to get what they want. And of course, when they don't get it, then they get very frustrated, because they cannot quite accept the fact of the matter that nowadays there are limits to their military capability. In fact, military capability is always limited unless you are willing to just exterminate the enemy and probably get very badly hurt in the process. But as long as you are fighting a more conventional war, you are not going to be able to get what you want. You know, nobody got it. The Americans didn't get it in Korea. They didn't get it in Vietnam. They didn't get it in Iraq. They didn't get it in Afghanistan. And so they should realize that these wars are only operations to keep certain sectors of the economy running and to make a lot of money for a lot of people. But in the end, you have to stop and look for something else to do, which probably means another war. So we don't know what will happen in the South China Sea in the coming years, and whether Taiwan will be actively fought for between China and the US. But right now, the focus is on trying to weaken Russia, and that is not going as well as planned. So whether the US will decide to let go or whether they will persist is something that we will see by the beginning of next year, I think.
So we come to another question, which is again come from the audience. Actually, last question I think I'm going to take is if the new world order is talking about, will BRICS be a part of the new world order, or new world order is still an imagination?
I think what's happening between Russia and China, which is the formation of a new monetary system that is dollar-free, that is the most serious. On the one hand, it is the most serious challenge to the US economic supremacy, or at least economic preponderance, on the one hand, and it is also the greatest hope for emerging developing countries to become independent from Western financial institutions and be able to run trade on their own terms and in their own currencies, which is the only sensible way to be a prosperous and independent country. As long as you have to buy dollars in order to purchase what you need somewhere else, you are obviously not able to achieve economic, financial, and therefore political independence. So this is a serious initiative which is now unfolding, primarily between Russia and China, but with the support of other BRIC countries and countries which are probably going to be part of BRICS or the SCO, like Iran, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Iraq, and some other countries in North Africa, like Egypt, Algeria. Many of them have already made formal requests to join BRICS, and in some cases to join the SCO. So that shows there is a real seismic change taking place in the world, a seismic transformation. And I don't think the West can stop it. It can delay it, but it cannot stop it. And it will mean that the West, at best, will have to deal on equal terms with other nations and other regional groupings, including ASEAN, including a number of African countries, including South American countries. And it will no longer be able to throw its weight around and claim exclusive leadership. That era is over. And that's what Putin has been saying over and over, and even Xi Jinping has said so. So unless the West is able to achieve a stunning victory by default on Russia and China and Iran, I think this project is going ahead, and it will lead either to a really rapid decline of the West, which is already visible and which could then accelerate, or it will at least lead to a rebalancing, which means that the West would have to scale down its ambitions, probably reduce its economic projection, because it would have to live within its means, which means it would have to cut back on a lot of expenses, such as the US military budget, which is outrageously inflated and which should be slashed by at least 70%. And that in itself would lead to a downsizing of Western power. But it could probably be healthy because, although we don't know what shape the world will take, it would mean that everybody would have to be more careful because there wouldn't be any overwhelming power anymore. So let us see. I mean, of course, many other things can come in, and nobody particularly wants China to become a hegemon. But then China will probably take a long time to get there, even if it does. And we don't know what the internal situation in China will look like, because it's obviously not so stable or settled as many people think.
Thank you so much, Kom, and thank you all the audience for asking these wonderful questions. Please do like, share, and subscribe. I think it's very clear from our discussion that there are a lot of media noise around everything, and but the facts are something else. We need to start looking at between the lines of all the news anchors. And I would suggest that to all the people who are watching the show is that search and make your own decision, because it's easy to search information all over the world, but sometimes the information is also hidden from search engines. So search and verify before you make any decision on this. So thank you so much, Kom, and thank you all the viewers. And do share, like, and subscribe. Namaste.
Namaste.